Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen who have joined us on this Dr. Fundi Digital Health platform via multiple channels, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and the Dr. Fundi website. My name is Dr. Fundi Lenyati. I'm the host on this channel. Today is the 10th of August, 2020, a day after the National Women's Day. But in South Africa, we don't just celebrate the National Women's Day. The whole month, it's a month that we put aside and we say it's a Women's Month. It's a month that we use to advocate for change, to promote the rights of women in South Africa. As we know, in our constitution, there is equality as far as males and females. However, those Bill of Rights within our constitution, when you look at that and the reality on the ground, there's still a big gap. We have a big problem in South Africa of gender-based violence, of femicide. In workplaces, there's still a situation where there's unequal pay, opportunities, in workplaces and in other areas. You find that there's more opportunities for males as compared to females. So there's still a long way to make sure that what is contained in the Constitution is actually the reality on the ground. So as the Dr. Fundi platform, we decided that we will use the month of August to invite women who have in their chosen careers, women who have made great strides to show that in spite of all these man-made glass ceilings or problems to limit the advancement of women, but to make sure that people know that in spite of those, there are other women who've been able to rise above those and actually achieve great things. So today, I've got a special guest, and our guest today is Ms. Tumi Dlamini. Tumi Dlamini, who originates from Edendale in Pietermaritzburg, Eden, So I'll just go through a little bit about, Tumi's bio so that you guys can see why she was invited, to be our special guest today. Now, Tumi is an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa, who did have, undergrad B Social Sciences and then postgrad LLB at UCT. Now, she was the first woman partner at Bowmans law firm, which is an international law firm. She has gone back to study, and she did her master's in public admin and public policy at Harvard University, Kennedy School of Government. She is currently the advisor to the African peer review mechanism of the African Union. She is actually a specialist in African development, and she has recently been made a president of the Harvard University Association in South Africa. And she'll tell us all about these positions that she's occupying. But in terms of her working background, she's got a multidisciplinary background, in public policy, in public-private cooperation, in corporate law, and African development. All right. So she really is somebody who, in her young life, has actually achieved so much. We can't just showcase people who are in the 50s only. We also need to showcase those who are much younger to show that it is possible. You don't have to be over 50 for people to actually recognize the work that you have done. All right. And like I said, she's currently an advisor at the African Peer Review Mechanism, an organ of the African Union, where she's got a dual responsibility to lead and promote corporate governance corporate governance policies and initiatives on the African continent. She's also a head of global relations and partnerships for intergovernmental institution and is the founding director of the African Network on Corporate Governance of State-Owned Enterprises, a project of the African Union, World Bank, and the African Development Bank. Before then, she was an executive director at the Master Builders SA, which is a business association of employers in the construction and the infrastructure industry in South Africa. Again, a woman of firsts. She was the first woman and the first Black person to hold an executive position in that 110-year-old, organization. But before then, she was actually in an executive position as the head of international relations and African legacy projects at the 2010 FIFA World Cup local organizing committee of South Africa. She was responsible for managing and coordinating international affairs, including using the World Cup platform to promote and position South Africa as a tourism and investment destination. She has served in many boards and is very passionate about promoting access to quality education. Obviously, she believes that education is one of the greatest levelers, out there that can take, somebody from a very, very challenged level in society to actually the highest level. She's a chair, or she has been a chair of the board of the CEDA Empowerment Fund. And also, she was appointed in the inaugural governance committee of the CAF, that is the soccer body for the continent. And in the committee, they are tasked with introducing governance reforms and to promote integrity and good governance, within that football structure on the continent. Now, all of these challenges, or all of these responsibilities that she has, she's going to tell us how they hope to, make headway, because in areas like football, we always hear about this and that, not only in the CAF, but also the world body. So it will be interesting to hear a lot about those things. Tumi, welcome to the Dr. Fundi channel.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you, Dr. Fundi, and good afternoon to everybody who's watching and listening.
Yes. I had to read all of that to make sure that you understand that, you have achieved great things. And because of that, we believe that there is a lot that they can gain by listening to your story. But before we get to your story, I'm going to try, I hope it will work, a little poem that I think is relevant for today. But if it doesn't work, we'll then get back to our conversation. All right. So I'm asking you and the viewers to please be patient. And by the way, I did not even welcome the viewers. I welcome you all. Thank you for choosing to be with us during this transmission. All right, let me try and see if I'll be able to get this on. All right. Okay, I don't seem to be able to get that. It has disappeared, which is fine. I wanted to play the poem by our former, state president, President Thabo Mbeki, which is a poem that most people like, that says, "I am an African." I thought when we are hosting somebody who's actually involved in the day-to-day of making sure that that vision of the African continent, being a leading continent in the world, becomes a reality in our lifetime. But unfortunately, it hasn't worked, which is fine. Tumi, I'll call you Tumi. Don't mind me just saying Tumi. Eh?
By all means, please.
All right, but just on the name, that's my first thing. Tumi is a Sotho, name, and
Yes.
you come from Edendale in KZN.
Yes.
Now, how did it come that you have a Tumi or Itumeleng Dlamini? Yeah. Why
Well,
Itumeleng?
yeah, thank you. And by the way, it's quite an honor for me to be here this afternoon, and to everybody who's watching, thank you for making the time. Well, it's interesting that should be the first question you ask me, because when I was growing up, that became the first question anybody asked me in KZN. Why are you called Itumeleng? Nobody's called Itumeleng. So basically, my father was a Motswana man who left Krugersdorp to go live in KZN.
Yeah.
And he met my mother and they had me. And
Yeah.
so I was given a Tswana name, Itumeleng, but I had my mother's surname.
Yeah.
And so it was always a case of a lot of people would get very confused and get very curious. But I think in a way it also tended to define me, because I grew up thinking I was quite unique. Nobody I had met in my earlier life was Itumeleng. It was only when I got to university that I realized that half of South Africa is called. So,
which means joy, or rejoice. So it means when you were born, your parents were extremely, extremely happy about your birth.
Absolutely. And as a child, I would ask my father, what does it mean? Why did you give me this name? And he would say, because we're all so happy when we received this angel.
Yeah. No, thank you, man. And whilst talking about family, what kind of family did you come from? How many siblings do you have? What kind of environment did you grow up in? In the greater, Pietermaritzburg and Edenvale, and yeah, just a little bit about that. Are you a last born, first born, middle child?
Yes. So I was born and bred in an area called Edendale, but specifically Guadambuza in Edendale, which is not too far from the Edendale Hospital. Yeah. And I was raised by my mom, my grandmother, and my mother's sister, because my father lived in Durban at the time. And so I had these women that really, in my upbringing, I would say fostered what we would now call, old school values, but values of respect, humility, honor. And I think, so that shaped my life from a very early stage, that I had all these strong women that surrounded me. And in fact, up until I went to school, I didn't realize that you can only have one mother, because my mother and my mother's sister, I called both of them Ma, until kids at school told me, well, actually, you can't have two mothers. And I was surrounded by a lot of cousins. I was an only child from my mother and my father, but because I had all of these cousins surrounding me, it never felt like I was an only child. But in essence, I was. And my father would later on go on to get married. And I have a lot of siblings, actually, from my dad's part of the family. So I do come from a big family, even though I come from a small family. And I have if that makes sense, it seems to be the main theme in my life, the contradictions of my life. So I have a younger brother, his name is Sihle, from my mom, and from my dad, I actually have 19 siblings, whom I all know by name. Well, we have a strong relationship with. So I come from both large and small families, but I would say that by far the greatest influence in my life was my grandmother, who lived in Guadambuza in Pietermaritzburg. She was a retired nurse, and she worked in various hospitals, worked with Dr. McCord when they established the McCord Hospital in KZN, and was the first registered midwife in what was then Natal, which is now KZN.
Wow. So this thing about being the first is not only in your generation with you. I mean, 2 generations before you, your granny was already a first.
Well, yes.
Like you said, first registered midwife.
Yes, indeed. Although it never really occurred to me, I never made the connection until I read a book that was written about her and Dr. McCord. And I thought, my grandmother was called a pioneer. And I thought, really? Okay, so, well, obviously that comes from her. But I would say what she taught me was the value of community and the value of surrounding myself with community and the value of giving back to the community which we live around. And so because she spent a lot of her retired time, in organizations, organizing women and organizing girl children. And there was a school not far from our home, which was called the Georgetown High School. And I would remember that every afternoon, at least twice during the week, I would accompany her to go because she gave pastoral care to students at Georgetown High School. So she was very much a community leader, very much a community engager and organizer.
All right. So clearly you had very, very strong, influence from strong women around you. That's the kind of woman that, we need in the new South Africa. Very strong women, just like those women in 1956 who marched, the courage that they had to face the might of the apartheid government, and we still need more of that as a country, as a continent. So you actually, got your foundation from a very, very strong, a woman, and it's no surprise then that you actually shining in your own right, as a woman. Yeah. So fine. You had those values of responsibility, humility, honor, and I think self-confidence as a woman. You went through some primary school and high school. Anything you want to share about schooling in general? As we move forward towards your working life.
Yes, so I think I had what was then in the 80s typical schooling life. I went to a school not too far from my home, started off at Nichols and then at Sigodini, which I think as far as academic inclination is concerned, Sigodini really provided the basis for encouragement to do well and to excel in everything that I do. And it's a school that I'm very proud to be associated with up until now. And then high school.
Oh, so that's a primary school.
That was primary, yes. Where the teachers were really committed to, the growth and development of their young students. And then high school, I went to a convent school, which was about close to 2 hours away from Maritzburg. It was a boarding school called Montebello High School. It was all girls. And that is where I began in my mind to take shape of, who I was in relation to the broader society, in relation to what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I think like most Catholic boarding schools, really, very strict, very prayer-centered, which was quite enlightening and which has been a positive force in my life. And also, it comes with the part of being in a convent school, the guilt, the Catholic guilt as they call it, but also the purity about it. So I think I'm very much a woman's woman. I've been surrounded by women, particularly in the early stages of my life, and I have formed long-lasting friendships, some of whom are actually watching today. So it was, I think, the most beautiful, the most beautiful part of my early life, yes.
Yeah. All right, now I'm just gonna be a bit naughty. Please don't mind my question.
Okay.
Some of the young ladies who come out of those Catholic schools where they were doing things by the book, because of the routine within those, they get out of school and they start to experience life outside of those, especially the tertiary level, and sometimes they lose it. they get confused by boys,
Yes.
and all of that. Yeah. So I'm gonna ask you the same question. Boys at high school, or just after high school, they did not confuse you.
Oh, I mean, it came with the territory. I had to be confused because I went to the strict regimented environment and a home that was so strict. And suddenly I was in Cape Town and I had all this freedom and I had no idea what to do with it.
Yeah.
But I think that's the beauty of grounding your child in certain values, because they take that with them. So even though all of it was very new, I mean, I had never been to a party before I went to university. And suddenly I met a party and there are boys and there's alcohol. But I think if you're grounded in something that is bigger than yourself, and you know where you come from, and you know who you belong to, you know who your parents are, and you know the community that you come from, that grounds you. So I finished university in record time. I got lost a little bit, but tell me who didn't.
Yeah, well,
I survived.
Well, you'd rather get lost at that time than when you are actually, working. Otherwise, it can be a problem much later in life. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So you did your undergrad, B social sciences, in record time. But let's just go back a little bit. What made you choose B social sciences?
Well, so when I was growing up, I wanted to be a doctor. But my maths didn't quite agree with me, my maths and science. So that kind of chose the career path for me. And then at some point, closer to matric, I decided that actually I wanted to be a lawyer. I was reading a lot of history books. I was getting inspired a lot by some of the, political icons, social icons. And I decided that for me to play a role in my country, I would need to do it as a lawyer. And so that's how I chose law school. But then you couldn't go straight into LLB. So then I did a social science degree, majored in political and African politics and industrial sociology, and then law.
Yes. All right. And so you did the first 3 years of B social sciences, and then you applied to do an LLB.
Then I applied to do an LLB at UCT, very luckily got in. And that's where I spent another 3 years of university life. So in total, I spent 6 years working towards a law degree. And I must say, at university, I also, particularly within the second part, LLB, I also got involved in quite a number of initiatives that we had. Like I worked for the legal aid clinic that was run by UCT. So we used to work in Guguletu Township. We'd go there once a week, provide legal advice. I worked for the university court. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, when we were still students, at medical school, now this is before 1994. Firstly, we could not stay at the main campus because main campus was in a white area. So we had to stay in Wentworth, which was the colored area, and it was initially for medical students. And then later on, any other Black student who wanted, a place to stay would stay there. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this story is that, during the student life, then there's a lot of student politics. And you would have guys who are doing law. Others were already doing, LLB. It was those days you would start with B juris or B proc, and then you do an LLB. So you'd have these guys who are doing law, and you'd have the medical students. And during student body meetings, the legal guys would shine in terms of the command of the English language and and some of the legal lingo, prima facie evidence and this mutandis or things like those, So when I talk to somebody who's doing law or who's a lawyer, I always remember. I mean, one of the guys was who advocated Siminya, Yes, Ishmael. He was, I think, Azapo those days, and he used to give the Azaso guys, a big time, in terms of arguing things out. But anyway, that's not about me. The interview is about you. And so you did your LLB and you were volunteering your time, in doing law clinics and all of those things. How were those what do you call them, moot courts and whatever? Where you guys practice arguing cases and stuff? How were those?
Well, I mean, I enjoyed it. It was part of the curriculum for us. I did only one moot, actually, and it was adjudicated by a very young judge who had just come into to become a judge in Cape Town, and now we know him as Judge Hlophe. Yeah. So he came in, I remember, and it was just amazing, the wealth of knowledge, legal knowledge that he had. But it was also a very frightening thing to have to do, because you have to argue your case, you have to do your research. And then, of course, they had to invite a proper judge to do it. Yeah. But I think, that's the sort of training that prepares you for the later on in life stages that you will be occupying. And I'm forever grateful for that sort of experience.
Yes, yeah. And another thing I remember, about legal students, was some of them who did forensic law. Then they had to go to the pathology, a place where they do postmortems. And some of the guys would then drop the course after that. Well, they just could not see what they were seeing, during that. Did you get any exposure?
No, not at all, fortunately for me. But all my friends, all my childhood friends, for whatever reason, they ended up being doctors and they went to UKZN. Yeah. And so one of them took me and I went to see a cadaver and I'm like, this is what you do? So I had that experience, but not as a law student.
Not as a law student. And were you guys also still expected to do Latin as part of your legal studies?
Oh, yes. I had to repeat that twice, although I don't think, hopefully my daughter can hear that. You do it once, it doesn't quite work, and then you go the second time.
Yeah, all right, lovely. And so you qualified with your LLB, and then it was time now for you to go to work, find employment. Yeah, so just take us through that, yeah?
Well, so after finishing in Cape Town, I actually had to make a decision, which law firm and what type of law. But I think primarily what shaped my decision ultimately was I'd been away since the age of 12 from home, because I had to go to boarding school. And I thought I needed to get back to knowing my mom particularly. And so I decided to go to Durban, where I did my articles, and that's legal training with the law firm called Shipston and Wiley. So you do a whole swift of disciplines. You rotate from labor law to litigation, and then ultimately I settled with maritime law, which was very interesting. It was more around international trade, really. And then after that, the big city of Johannesburg was beckoning.
No, just wait on that, because let's just talk about this maritime law. My understanding, as somebody from the outside, is that in South Africa, we still have very few Black lawyers who are actually, experts in that space. It's a, it's a space that has not really transformed much. And what was your, your experience as you were, venturing into that space, whilst you were still in Durban?
It was very untransformed. And these were early days of, having Black people participating in the legal practice outside of, say, criminal law, human rights law, and moving into corporate type of law. So I mean, it felt very strange to be in that space, because I was the only Black female, in that space, surrounded by white men for the most part. There was one Indian gentleman who actually took me under his wing. So already from very early on in my career, I got to be put in a space where you are the only woman or you're the first Black woman. But at that time of my career, my mind was not really about I was still trying to discover myself, and I was still trying to decide what it is that I really wanted to do with my life.
Yeah.
And so maritime seemed exciting for me because there was an international aspect to it, which I found quite exciting. And so that's why I chose it. But
Yeah.
it was difficult. It was a difficult environment to work in because there was always a sense of you are the other, Yeah.
Okay. And so you then decided after how long that now I'm now moving on?
Well, 2 years. And, right from the moment that I left UCT, I knew that my stay in KZN would be a short-lived one. It was literally, I needed to do my articles, gain that sort of experience, spend time with my family, and then move on to Johannesburg, which is what I did.
So did you optimize the time with mom, and then fill up the lost time, or it was too late to fill up the lost time?
Well, I think I did partly, not as much as I would have loved to. There were far too many competing interests. Imagine your first year, second year of working,
Yeah.
you have a social life, and then you have mom and you have home, and there was far too much competition.
Yeah. But anyway, at least you tried. You
Yes,
tried.
I tried. I was a good daughter. I am a good daughter.
Okay, I wish we could interview. All right, but anyway, so you decided now 2 years is up. I need to go to Johannesburg. Tell us about that. Yeah.
I decided I would go to Johannesburg. One of the firms that I'd applied to, leaving UCT was Bowmans. And then I had to make the decision to stay in Durban. So I made contact with them and I said, look, I'm looking to move to Johannesburg. Would you still be keen? And they were. So they invited me and I went to speak with them. And that's how I ended up with Bowmans, where I became an associate.
Yeah. But why Bowmans? Remember now, you say you were interested in them even just after coming out of UCT, but then you thought, okay, no, I need to spend 2 years with my mom in Durban, then come. So what attracted you about them as a law firm?
As a law firm. So, my initial thoughts around Bowmans, or at least my thought processes around choosing a law firm to go to after UCT, I basically said, what are the 3 best law firms in the country? Wrote them down, and those are the people I applied to. And I thought, okay, I'll go to them. Yeah. So Bowmans was one of the best 3 in Johannesburg, and that's how I made the decision, And it turned out to be a good decision because there were other bigger law firms at the time, and I think there still are. But with Bowmans, the difference was the sort of time and effort that they put in training young professionals, so that for me ended up working very well, even though when I made the choice, I didn't realize that this is what I would need.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And then just tell us about your time there. What were your highlights? What are the insights? What are the things that you feel, when I look back at my time at Bowmans, I'm grateful for this, and was it a smooth sailing, or was it also a challenging environment, untransformed environment still?
Well, Bowmans was a mixed bag of experiences, in the sense that I was coming into Johannesburg, big city, bright lights. And I think professionally, the training, as I have said, the training for their young lawyers was really up to scratch. It was one of the best. But I think like most entities or organizations in this country, it is and was a reflection of the broader South African society. So there was a sense at the time that, Black young lawyers were not being given the same opportunities that white young lawyers were being given, those sort of opportunities. So there was a need always to question, so you could never just rest and think that, I've gotten into Bowmans. If I do the work, if I'm technically astute, then I will go ahead, then, I will proceed. There was a sense that as a Black lawyer, particularly a woman, you have to work 10 times harder than the next person to get the sort the same sort of recognition. But so the manner in which law firms are structured is that you have a senior partner who becomes kind of your mentor, or the person that you can talk to, the person that you speak to around how you develop in the firm. So I was quite lucky as well to get someone who had come in as a senior partner from Durban. So there was that sort of connection between us.
Yeah.
And so, he was a lot of help to me. And I also had a lot of other colleagues who were my age. We were all starting up in the legal field. And so there was a sense of community, and a sense of community that was important around, discussing and plotting how do we put some of these issues forward. Because, at the time, I think there was only one Black partner, out of a firm that probably had 30 partners. So you don't have a sense that you are represented in the decision-making bodies. So really it was an eye-opener for me about being in a South African entity and feeling a sense of the disconnect, with the people that make decisions. Yeah.
All right. So how long did you stay there?
So I ended up staying 5 years, which was broken down. I also went to work in London. So I was working as a corporate lawyer, international mergers and acquisitions. And one of the things that you pride yourself as a lawyer in that field is that you have to go, work in some of the big cities around the world. So, I made the decision to go work in London. Some of my colleagues would go work in New York, to gain that sort of international exposure and to how, corporate entities or corporate work is structured in other parts of the world. So I spent a year in London as a lawyer, as a corporate lawyer. And again, another very interesting part of my life. And then I came back to South Africa, again to Bowmans, and I was made partner now. So once you're a partner at a law firm, of course, there are junior partners and there are also senior partners, but there's a sense of I've achieved this, so what next, And I think then I was 31, so I became a partner at a very young age. I used to work very hard. I had goals and, I was very determined. But then you're 31 and you think, I'm a partner at an international law firm, what's next for me? This can't be the rest of my life. And so I started getting very restless around that time. Yeah.
Before we move on, as a partner in an international law firm, you one of the few Black faces, you are female. Was there any program to try and identify and maybe mentor younger lawyers, females, so that by the time you move, at least there are people that you've brought up as well? Was there an opportunity for such?
Oh yes, absolutely. And that's the thing about getting to a higher level. It's about making sure that you look around you and you look behind you and say, who's coming next? So we did have a program. When I say we, I mean, I was basically the first Black woman who was coming into that sort of position. So I had to look around and find allies, some of my colleagues who were also still associates at that time. And, we had in very informal groups, of course, because we were not part of the broader governance structure of the firm, but we organized ourselves and said, okay, what is it that we need as African lawyers in this firm? And one of those was we need access to work, but access to quality work, so that if you are a corporate lawyer, you are not spending all your days either making photocopies or incorporating companies, but you're dealing with proper, corporate work. So we decided that young lawyers need proper, work. They need access to senior partners by way of mentorship, by way of ensuring that once you become an associate, you have the right sort of person that can guide you some of the complex problems, because we were not getting the complex problems. So therefore, I took on a role that I hadn't envisaged for myself as a mentor to young lawyers who were coming up, behind me. And because I already had a voice by virtue of being a partner, even though you are junior, you have a voice, you have a place at the table. So then it was important to play that advocacy role to say there is a problem. Young people are not getting quality work. And so, through that advocacy within the firm, we're able to at least move the needle just slightly. It would have been great if we could have said, out of that work, suddenly we had, 5 or 7, Black partners, female partners, but it took a long time. And I think that was a lesson that I learned earlier on, but that would become even more conspicuous or more important to me later, that the job of changing takes time, and that you can't rush it, and that you changing people's attitudes, and the challenge of changing, it takes time, and so we get discouraged when we have small wins and we want to see large wins very quickly. And that's, the unfortunate or the nature of transformation of this country, that it's not going to happen within any one person's lifetime or effort.
Yeah. All right. So you were itchy, you now a partner, you like, okay, what's next? So what happened then?
So I was itchy, and I started thinking about, why did I study law actually? And I remembered that the reason why law was so appealing to me was because I thought I would use it as an instrument or tool to better people's lives. In fact, when I was at law school, what I was thinking was about human rights law. And yet you get into a law firm, and I just moved with the flow of being placed in litigation, corporate work. And then suddenly I thought, this is not speaking to me. There has to be more to life than what I'm doing, because I couldn't make the connection between what I was doing on a daily basis and how it impacted people on the ground, which was very important to me. And so I actually took time off to just think about this question and to really reflect. And I decided that whatever I was going to do next and for the rest of my life, it had to be around improving people's lives. And I had to see a connection between what I do and how that changes anybody's life. And so at the time, I thought, okay, how does that happen? And I thought, okay, there was, I felt that I wanted to do international work. South Africa had just come out of the apartheid regime. We were working, or at least the government was working hard to ensure that we promote this country overseas. We promote trade and investment, we grow our economy. And I thought, this is what I want to do. But the manner in which I thought I would do it, I thought, okay, you could either do it by working for government, going to DECO, or you work for tourism, where you bring in tourism and that translates to, smaller tourism businesses. But in the end, I did neither of that. I did try. And then it was around 2006, South Africa had just won the right to host the World Cup. And the World Cup was at fever pitch level in this country. And I thought, I would love to work for the World Cup, but I don't want to be involved in building stadiums or the operations of it. I see it as an amazing product that we've created as a country to open ourselves to the rest of the world and say, us as an apartheid country, but actually we are more than that. We're open for business. And so that became my next role. One day, I was at the airport and I saw Mr. Danny Jordan, and I said, where else am I ever going to bump into this man? So I went up to him and I introduced myself. I told him I work for Bowmans. Congratulations on winning the World Cup, and I'd like to work with you. And so that's just like that. And he said, okay, what's your name? Okay, give me your card, call my office. And within the next 2 weeks, I had a job. And I thought, wow, okay.
Wow.
So hence my journey into the World Cup started. So
firstly, you were thinking about it, you were preparing your mind about it, and then an opportunity presented itself you know,
Yes.
in the most unlikely of places at the
The
airport,
most,
and you decided you are taking this opportunity. It's now or never.
now or never. It was one of those moments that I thought, I have probably 2 minutes. And if I don't speak to this man, who knows if I'll ever see him again? And
Yeah.
how am I going to do this? Yeah.
So it's the whole thing about preparedness and opportunity leads to
And
success.
yeah, definitely. And I didn't think about it then at the time, but now I know there's even something called the elevator pitch.
Yes.
So you practice the moment you get into a lift with someone, you literally have 30 seconds to tell your story and convince them. So yeah.
And surely he was convinced for you to get a job in 2 weeks. And so now you are this, big wig at the Bowmans, and now you have to tell them that I'm moving on.
Yes.
How easy was that?
Well, I kind of softened the blow because, I also recognize that being a Black woman partner, and I was still the only one. So, they needed the numbers and I was the number. But I was no longer feeling being part of that establishment or being part of not just the establishment, but being part of the legal sort of work that I was doing. So as I said, I actually took time off. So I said I would go on a sabbatical, which is what I did. But within that time, I think it crystallized in my mind that I can't go back. I have to find other things to do with my life, which which to me were more meaningful. And I'm not saying that the legal work or corporate work is not meaningful, but I'm just talking about my own experience and my own value systems about how I saw my work.
Yeah. All right. So you got the job. So you joined this new baby local organizing committee, South Africa, for the 2010 World Cup. Yeah. How was that? Coming from a very structured environment of a big international law firm with protocols and everything, established entity where there is a document for everything. Now you're going into an entity I think was still in a development stage.
Yeah. So exactly, there was a complete culture shock. Law firms are very regimented, the hierarchies are very clear. The processes are in place. There's very little room for maneuvering or making mistakes. You have to try really hard to make a mistake in terms of the process. Yeah. And then I moved to this place, and there were probably still only just 10 people or less than 10 people that were working for the LOC at the time. They were still setting up, and suddenly I'm just thrown into this den, and there's nothing that's written down. It's like you just do what's got to be done on that particular day. And so that's what I did. If the job required me to go and photocopy and send documents, that's what I did. If the job required me at the time to sit around the table with the minister of whoever I minister or whatever and make decisions around how are we going to ensure that we involve the provinces, what sort of processes. So it was exciting. It was exhilarating, as you can imagine. But
pioneering work.
Yeah, and also pioneering. We had never hosted an international event of that large scale in the country or in the continent even. So it was, there was no blueprint for anybody. Of course, we could learn from Germany, but at the end of the day, we had to do it ourselves. So, those few of us, we had a small office in Sandton, and then soon after they built Safa House and we moved there and more people came. But, I was part of the first people together with some of my colleagues that were the nucleus of the World Cup.
Yeah. All right. And so, just take us through quickly, because I want us to get to the African part of it, just quickly through learnings during that time. And I'm particularly interested in the fact that you were facing outside as an international relations, person for the LOC. And there was so much pessimism out there in the world about the ability of South Africa, or of Africa for that matter, because other people, they just think that, you know, Africa is just one big country, you know? So people in other continents did not understand how South Africa got to be given, you know, the right to host the 2010 World Cup. And so you had to start, you know, convincing people that we can do this on behalf of the local organizing committee. So how difficult or how easy was this? Was up until maybe 6 months before the World Cup, there were still people who were talking about the plan B. You know, let's look at plan B, and Australia put their hand up, yeah, you know, and people like Platini still were discouraging people from, you know, coming here. And then there was the vuvuzela noise that would cause damage to people's hearing. So there were a lot of negatives, you know, and I'm more interested in, as the person facing the world, how did you deal with those things?
Well, like I said, you know, I'm going into the World Cup organizing committee. One of the things that I wanted to do was not so much to work as part of the operations, but so I had this role of head of international relations. And you are quite right, the pessimism that existed around an African country, around an African country's ability to deliver on such a project of magnitude was just incredible, you know. So we had to, at any given point in time, before we even get on a flight, be writing letters, you know, press statements around, you know, what were our milestones, that we have reached a particular milestone. We have a stadium that's now finished. We have the airport expansion program that is still on track. And so my job really into international relations, it was around the end of 2008. And we were about to host the 2009 Confed Cup. And the person who had been doing this was Danny Jordan. And then one day he said, look, I've got to now focus on delivering the Confederations Cup. I can't keep going all over the world and trying to convince people. You've been here right from the beginning. I'm giving this role to you. And so that's how I got into that role of really going into the different countries. And I must say it was quite an honor and a privilege for me to have that role where I went into different parts of the world, and starting in Africa, because we had said it was an African World Cup, and mobilizing that sort of support, and also mobilizing that sense of common understanding on knowing that we are a partnership in delivering the World Cup. It was very difficult. It was difficult on the one hand to have to stand on a platform and hear people question the ability of your country, and hear people question just simply because you're African, for no other reason, not because they understood our capabilities as far as infrastructure was concerned, and not because, just because you are African and therefore your level of engagement, or rather your ability to deliver a high-end product is being questioned. So it was hard to do that, but you know, what helped a lot was the fact that the story sold itself. So I didn't need to stand on a podium and say, we will be ready. All I needed to do was, here is the Cape Town Stadium. These are the plans we put before you 2 years ago. This is where we are, you know, 8 months before the World Cup is delivered. So we are delivering. But that didn't mean in any sense that they believed it. You know, as you were saying, even 4 months before the World Cup, there were still plans or talks around Plan B. So, you know, as an African, it made me realize just how difficult, how badly positioned we are as a continent and as a country, and the need to therefore rebrand and reposition ourselves, which is exactly what the end goal of the World Cup was, to reposition this country as an investment destination, tourism destination, to showcase all the infrastructure development that we have, you know, the high-end cables that enabled us to ensure that this World Cup was broadcast in all the countries of the world, you know, in 109 countries of the world. And so those are all, you know, the experiences for me that were very meaningful. And I think that have shaped my life and probably have shaped what I've gone on to do after that.
Yes.
Because after that, there was a clear sense in me that Africa needs its people to speak for it, and that Africa Africa's development can only be in the hands of African people, and that we cannot outsource it to Europe or to the USA, but that we needed people with skills on the continent to come together and work together towards this common purpose.
Yeah, you said Europe and you said USA. I could throw in China there as well, you know.
Well, yeah, China, although they've become an ally for us, you know,
yeah.
and I mean, if they did believe that we couldn't host it, you know, they were not as loud as some of the Western countries.
Agreed, agreed,
Yeah.
agreed. All right, so you guys delivered on the best World Cup at that point that had made the most revenue, you know, and making all the critics before then to actually eat humble pie. And how was the feeling after you guys delivered the best World Cup and proving you know, the naysayers wrong?
Yeah, well, you know, it was a case of thinking we've done it. We have proved to the world that we can do this. We have proved that Africans are capable, that Africans can take their roles and their place on the international stage, you know. But very soon after that, we also realized that it wasn't enough, that it was part of a process and an event in a very long journey towards the recognition and acknowledgement of Africa as a world-class player, whether it's in politics or security issues, and that we needed this event, but also that we are going to need many other events. So not necessarily sports events, but that the road towards integration, the road towards rebranding and positioning Africa will require a number of small steps that put together will all lend us to the Africa that we want.
Yeah. But you didn't leave, you know, after the World Cup. You continued to do some stuff. I think was it Cup of Nations or something. There was something you did soon thereafter. And I just want us now to move to your time at MBSA.
Yes. Well, so those were board appointments where I was invited following the World Cup to now sit on the Africa Cup of Nations. But my next professional role after the World Cup was the Master Builder South Africa, which is a business association for the construction industry in the country. And so what it does is it represents the business industry in a number of areas, such as advocating for improved policies to enable growth, trade within that particular sector. It also promotes standards within the construction industry. But unfortunately, I mean, I also chose to go to that industry at a time soon after the World Cup. And of course, the industry had been accused of, you know, non-competitive practices. So I came in at a time when it was just on fire, and yeah.
But what lessons did you learn at that time? You know, what was your role within the organization, you know, or the association, and what were the lessons for you now as Tumi in terms of, you know, like now we are going through the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of the negativity that is coming out is relating to corruption around PPEs and all of that. And corruption has always been associated with government and all of those things. But there was, you know, a group of top construction companies in the country being accused of anti-competitive practices, where they were deciding who must get which stadium and all of that, and many other things. So how easy or how difficult was it, you know, for you having made the move to join them?
You know, I think that was perhaps a blessing in disguise, in the sense that there had been this narrative, which unfortunately continues to today, that corruption comes from government. And that narrative needed to change. And we needed to see, or the people on the ground need to realize, that there is an enabler in all of this, and private sector is just as guilty. So that's what it brought to the fore, so that the focus must not be primarily on government. And yes, it must be on government, because, you know, those are public monies and they represent people and they're elected. But however, we tend not to focus so much on the private sector because they're not elected and we consider them to be private money. But actually, you know, that is the biggest part of the problem. It's within private sector. So the difficulty, I think, was for private sector itself to actually acknowledge that their practices were corrupt. Because you would think that with all the stories and media reports that were going around, there was that acknowledgement from their part, but there wasn't. You know, because in their minds, this is how we've done business. And therefore, because this is how we've done business, it seems to be the way to do things. So, you know, again, to get people to change their minds or to change their behavior around certain practices that are entrenched in companies is very difficult. And it's going to take a lot of work. And that is, in my mind, I think I'm very glad that in a way, it's unfortunate that it happened, but it has shown us that we need to be focusing on private sector governance as well. So which is where corporate governance comes in. And I mean, if you look at Steinhoff, so those competition issues around the construction industry were 10 years ago. Yeah. And now we have Steinhoff still dealing with the issue, but Steinhoff just represents what is actually going on the ground. So there are so many other companies that we have not even had insights into.
I mean, the audit firms, the Hewletts of this world and many other, entities, we've now seen that it's actually not, something that is unique to the public sector, but actually, it's something that you get on both sides. There's the corruptor and the corruptee, and sometimes the corruptor is not within the public sector, is actually, from the private sector. Yeah. All right. So that was the space you were in, but then you decided that you want to further your studies, and you got a fellowship. If I'm not mistaken, that took you to Harvard University Kennedy School of Governance. Just talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, so my story of Harvard is very much linked to my experiences at MBSA. I think your question before was, what were your learnings out of MBSA? And interestingly enough, I think the biggest lesson that I had out of MBSA was just how fragile our democracy is. Because I got into a space which was very much occupied by men, white men in suits, and older men at that. And all of these men, so they brought me on board because they said, we need to transform. We live in the new South Africa. So you would think, well, the new South Africa happened in 1994, you would have gotten on with the program. But, so many years down the line, they hadn't. And so they said, help us transform ourselves. So that work that I had been given became my biggest lesson, professional lesson in life. Because I went in thinking, I know what needs to be done. We start, step A, step B, we get this consultant, we talk to these people. And what I hadn't bargained on was the fact that there would be resistance. And that the very same people that had asked me to come and lead the transformation would be the very same people that the moment I took the first step, they needed to make sure that it didn't happen. So I spent a lot of time feeling like I had failed. And it was quite hard for me because I thought, I have never failed at anything in my life. Why is this so hard? But I also, working with them, I also realized that these were white people who had a wealth of experience in construction, but who, because of the regeneration agenda and the transformation of this country, had felt left behind. Yeah. They didn't see a place for them in this country. Yeah. And so this is how it translated in the sense of them resisting the advances or the suggestions or the proposals of this Black woman that they themselves have brought on board. And so and then my contract came to an end and I wasn't going to renew it, and they didn't want to renew it. And I felt like a complete failure because I thought I'd completely misdiagnosed the situation here. And so I had no idea what sort of solutions to bring on board. And, I had always wanted to go to Harvard. It had been my dream as a child. When I was in high school, we had these teachers that came from the US and, so speaking to representation, and that come from Georgetown University. And for the first time, I thought I would love to go to such a university. And then I came across Harvard and I thought, I'm going to go to Harvard. But then life took on, studies, then the professional life. And then one day I thought, I was in my late 30s and I thought, I wonder when I turn 60, will I look at my life and regret not having gone to Harvard or at least given it a try? And so I applied and very luckily I got in, but I was also feeling very beaten up by that time, from my experiences at MBSA.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the highlights, really, I would say, of my life. Yeah.
All right. And so you got, you got to Harvard. You said it was a fellowship or something?
So yes, it was a fellowship, the Harvard South Africa fellowship that I applied to. But of course, you have to get into the school first before you can get the funding. So I applied to the school. And in fact, okay, there's a story that I'm not telling you. So while at MBSA, so I am busy thinking I am failing here. This is the first time I failed in my life. Then I call up this friend of mine in Cape Town and I'm like, I'm quitting this job. I don't want this sort of stuff on my resume, that I did this job and I didn't do it well. And she says to me, no, that's not what you do when when the rough gets going. What you do is you retreat and you go and you strategize. So then she introduced me to this book and Leading Dangerously. And it was written by a Harvard professor, Professor Ron Heifetz. And I read this book and I thought, oh my God, I can't believe that there are people go to school to learn how to deal with the situation that I'm facing, because everything he was talking about in his book, I was going through in South Africa. And that's when I thought, I have to go to Harvard. This is a sign. I've got to live my dream and Ron Heifetz is calling. So that's how I got in. Yeah.
You got in, and how was it? How was life in Boston? Yeah, how was life in Boston and how was life at Harvard?
Very cold to start off with. The winters are harsh, but I think it was a highlight. Like I said, I met people from all over the world, and I think these institutions, that's what they're about, really. I always say, when people ask me about Harvard, I always say the most difficult thing about Harvard is getting in. So they don't take people in. To get in is a major thing, but once you are inside, Harvard makes sure that you succeed. You have to try hard not to come out with a Harvard degree. So, so the biggest thing about Harvard and most of these Ivy League institutions, it's connections that you make, the networks, the people that you meet, and, and also they ingrain in you that you can do whatever it is that you want to do. Like literally, when you're at Harvard, if you want to come up with anything, Harvard will tell you, of course you can do it. And you do it this way and this way. So it's an environment like no other that I've been in. And it was really just an honor to be there and to meet the sort of people that I met, to have the sort of friends that I made from just about every African country. And, we keep in touch. We're on WhatsApp all the time. We are talking every day and saying, okay, some of them have become senior members of society, either in civil society or government. And so we're always sharing around some of the challenges that we're all encountering. It's an ongoing network of people. And I always feel like whichever country in the world I need to go to, I know someone, even when I haven't met that person. And that's what Harvard does, Yeah.
And so now you were interacting with people from across the globe, but also a lot of people from the continent who I assume many would like to see the continent doing better than it's doing now. So at what point did you develop the love for African development?
Well, Fundile. So
I know, obviously, there is the part from the World Cup and the exposure there and everything, but I'm talking now at policy development, this and that, the nuts and bolts of how to make it happen.
So the nuts and bolts of it was, partly my choosing the sort of course or master's program that I chose at Harvard, because I recognize that the love I have for the continent and my aspirations for my involvement have got to be matched by a particular skill that I don't have quite yet. And so how do I begin to narrow that gap or to gain that sort of skill? And so that's what drove me towards the master's in public admin and public policy, because I thought with my legal degree, with the experience I've had in the different organizations, I have grown a lot and I have amassed a lot of experiences, but I still need to understand how public policy is designed, how it is made, and how it is implemented. And so that is what shaped my choice of my master's program at Harvard. And as you rightly point out, when I got there, I met people who thought exactly the same way that I thought, and similar minds put together, and we all were just focused on what are our roles in contributing towards growing this continent.
Yeah. So you went through that, and how long did it take you, the program?
Oh, it's 12 months, it's a year.
It's a year. So you experienced the extreme cold of Boston and also the extreme heat.
The extreme heat, yes, best time ever, the summers.
Lovely city, Boston. So you're in Cambridge, obviously,
Yes, based in Cambridge,
Yeah. And how much interaction between Harvard and then MIT, being in the same space?
Yes. Well, so, I went to MIT quite a bit because we have what we call, it's not really exchange programs, but when you registered at Harvard, at some of the schools at Harvard, you can take classes from MIT. So there are some professors, like economics professors, that are world-renowned, and they're based at MIT and not necessarily at Harvard. So you can take a class there and register there. I didn't get to register for MIT classes, but I went over for quite a few talks. One of the things that Harvard and MIT do so well is on any given day, you get a speaker from the World Bank or the IMF or the president of this country. And it's a constant regeneration of ideas. And so I went to quite a few of their talks. And I think they even hosted a Methodist church at some point that I went to.
Yeah. No, and my son went to MIT, so so when I went to his grad in 2018, then I taught the city and all of that. But it's a lovely place. So, and then you came back, you finished your program. At what point did they make you a president? Is it there or?
That's very new, actually.
Yeah.
That's very, very new. Literally, that's only a month old. So basically,
we'll talk about that one later. I want us to get to your role in the AU. Did you come straight from Harvard and then you got into that role, or how did it happen?
So when I got out of Harvard, I actually had worked on my own projects that I wanted to do post-Harvard. And again, like I said, Harvard, they say whatever you're thinking, whatever you want to do, will help you shape it. And so I had started that work of putting together my own project, which would have been a non-governmental organization, a Pan-African and international organization. And then, when I got back home, I met with a former colleague who was running the APRM, the African Peer Review Mechanism. And then so we started talking, and he said, okay, so what's your plan? So I explained to him that this is the plan I've been working on, and this is the direction I'd love to move. It's a Pan-African entity. And he said, well, you know what, I think your plan will work. but you also need to ground yourself or anchor yourself within a particular institution, because on your own it becomes very difficult.
Yeah.
And he had said, we have current positions being advertised for corporate governance. You are a lawyer, you worked in corporate space, so apply, and maybe if you get in, then once you get out of that, you'll be in a better space because you would have built the sort of relationships on the continent that are required. So that's how, so I joined it immediately after Harvard, and that's where I have been. And like you said earlier on, my role really is around promoting corporate governance on the continent. And I think one of the projects that I'm really proud of, which I'm working on right now, is to develop a framework for corporate governance. So, in South Africa, we have the King Code of corporate governance, but not all African countries have a similar type of framework. And so we've identified that as a risk area, particularly moving into the African continental free trade area. And so my project then is to build and develop for lack of a better word, a King Code for Africa, which is the African guidelines for corporate governance.
All right, let's just go back a little bit. We all know, or most of South Africans would have been aware during the time of President Mbeki, about African Renaissance, where him, Obasanjo, President Obasanjo, and President Bouteflika from Algeria, they were the three that were driving a vision of a different Africa, and we had a lot about the peer review mechanism. But once they stepped down or were forced to step down, we sort of had like maybe the things have slowed down. So I'm gonna ask you, or I'm asking you, is it just my perception, or actually things did slow down when those three were no longer, driving that vision?
Well, I think it's partly true in the sense that the founding fathers, and we mention I'm at pains when I say founding fathers because it seems as if women were not there. But in any event, those were the people that were the public faces of the founding of the APRM. So once they vacated their roles or positions as heads of state, I must say that the institution itself kind of lost a bit of grounding, and through a number of reasons, really. But later on in the years as well, I would say like 5 years ago, the heads of state then made the decision that this institution is critical because I think we all understand that good governance should be the foundation of any development. And I mean, we see it in our country with just the current PE scandals and corruption, that with no good governance, you cannot deliver on the services you've promised. And so I think that a decision was taken to revive and revitalize the APRM. And so we have a new breed of heads of state that have put the kind of political will that is necessary to ensure that not only does the organization thrive, but that it can deliver on its mandate, which is to promote good governance on the continent. And so that is where we are now. And you will have probably, if you follow African development, have realized that it's an organization that has begun to really claim its place within the discourse of African development. And you will see, and then the question always is, but how do you know? Of course, there's not any one intervention that works. It's a number of interventions. But if you look at violence on the continent that's associated with elections, we're seeing less and less of violence around election time. And that's because good governance is beginning to take shape, and a lot of countries also recognize that they can't have stability without good governance in place.
And there's fewer coups as well,
Definitely, absolutely. I think the Africa of 20, 30 years ago is very different from the Africa we have today. And the challenges of security and instability that we had then have now been replaced by the challenges of economic transformation. So what are the sort of policies now that are necessary to intervene to ensure that socioeconomic transformation becomes a reality? And that's a good place to be at, because we're not dealing with coups, as you have said.
Yeah. Now, one of the challenges about the continent is that when it comes to matters of infrastructure development, whether we're talking, logistics and transport and all of those things, if somebody has to fly from Mali to South Africa, they might have to go via Europe before they come here, and generally there isn't much of intra-Africa trade and whatever. So the issue of infrastructure development, to be able to enable economic growth. You coming from that MBSA, which was dealing with issues of infrastructure and construction, and also the World Cup before then, where you guys had to put up a world-class infrastructure within a period of time. How much of those experiences do they give you hope that it's doable to actually, ensure that there is proper infrastructure development in Africa, and also, translating that into economic growth?
Well, you are quite right that infrastructure development remains one of the key challenges that's facing the continent currently. I would say that the current, or rather the recent coming into effect of the African Continental Free Trade Area is definitely a major achievement towards trying to deal with those issues. The biggest challenge out of infrastructure development is one of finance. How do we finance this sort of infrastructure? And, Africa has, to a very large extent and for a very long time, dependent on development aid. And as we all know, aid comes from the West, So therefore, it means that Africans are not funding their own development. So if you're not funding your own development, you rely on external parties who, through their financing arrangements with you, can also, make or insist on in a number of issues that may not necessarily be of benefit to you. Yeah. So the biggest question is, how do Africans finance their own development, their own infrastructure? And for me, that goes back to good governance. That's the answer. It's the answer because it is not true that there is no money in Africa. It is true that we have abundant resources on this continent, but they are not properly managed. And because they are not properly managed, we therefore lose a lot of money that could otherwise have been invested in projects such as the infrastructure projects. And so that is why the work of growing or good governance is important. We cannot stem the tide of the influence from the West through finances unless we can address our own corrupt practices as a continent. So I do think that the issue of mobilizing resources internally within our countries is key. I also do believe that cooperation within the continent is also the answer. And cooperation, you could argue that, but we have the AU, but the AU is just a part of the answer. It's a part of it because it is placed at a heads of state level. So, but how do you cooperate below that or in other parts of the continent, in other parts of the discipline? So how do you ensure that the private sector collaborates? How do you ensure that academics collaborate? How do you ensure that scientists cooperate? So we need to build those other institutions, or at least platforms that enable collaboration of African role players, stakeholders in different parts of disciplines. And that's how we ensure, I believe, that we begin to act with one voice, And, we have 55 member states, and South Africa on its own cannot solve these problems. Neither can Botswana on its own. But if South Africa and Cote d'Ivoire, even if you don't have all 55 countries coming together, but if you could have 2 or 3 or 4 countries coming together on a platform to collaborate on a particular issue, for me, that would be also contribute a lot to some of the challenges that we face.
One of the things you mentioned earlier that you are busy with is around issues of corporate governance within state-owned enterprises.
Yes.
You guys are setting up frameworks there. Now, as South Africa, we have seen a lot that can go wrong when the SOEs are actually used in a wrong way. Now, what lessons do you bring as you are trying to create the framework for the rest of the continent on the governance of SOEs so that they become the engine or contribute towards the development of their countries?
So the experience that we bring on board is not the experience of any one country. I think what a lot of South Africans don't probably recognize is that the issue of governance within SOEs is an issue that faces all of our African countries. They're not unique to South Africa, and neither are they unique to developing or emerging economies. So it's important, therefore, when we speak of this network, to understand what the objective is. And the objective is to have a platform for peer learning and peer exchanges of ideas about how country A or country B has addressed the issue of governance. And we have best practices in place as well. If you look at some of the most developed economies, so I'm also part of what is the OECD, which is the Organisation for Economic, So I sit in one of their working parties for state-owned enterprises. And I have insight, and I through that, I can see how much the developed countries have struggled, but also look at their journey towards transformation, and we can borrow from that. And obviously ensure that in all of our work in borrowing from how other developed countries have dealt with it, we customize it to our own African environment. So yes, it's hard, but I think we have to look at the positive as well. We could be sitting in complete blindness around what's happening in the SOEs, but the collapse of these entities has enabled us to see that something is very, very wrong and it needs to be addressed. And of course, whether the political power is there in South Africa to deal with it, that's a question that, anyone could answer based on what they see. But like I said, it's not a unique issue for South Africa.
Yes. So when you look forward, next 2 to 5 years, do you see a change? The embrace of good corporate governance practices, in the various countries of the continent. Although it's voluntary, to embrace the King's Form. It's a voluntary thing. For those that are in the JSE, you have to. But for others, it's not necessarily the case. But it's always a good practice to measure yourself, and aim for that level. It's not a law, but it is around ethics and this and that and that. Standards that being set. So do you see that there will be an embrace of this new way of doing things?
Well, I think there certainly will be. And I think that those entities that resist this sort of change will find themselves not being able to participate in some of the economic opportunities that will exist, particularly around, the trade between the countries. And that's because more and more financiers are looking at companies that are well run. They need to know that when they borrow or give their money, they loan their money to a company, it will be used for what it's intended for. And to ensure that that's the case, you need to have good governance structures in place. So now it makes sense, not simply because you have to comply, but it now makes sense business-wise. If your business does not have in place the necessary corporate governance structures, then your business may not, receive or be loaned funds. It may not. There are companies that may not be prepared to, for instance, collaborate with it. And so you are playing yourself out of the game if you are not going to play by the rules of the game. So I think that it may come to a place where it's no longer just the decision of the board or of the CEO to choose whether we want to or not, but it becomes a necessity. If you have to survive, it becomes a survival tool in the economic space. And that's my hope for what this corporate governance will do, because ultimately we know that corporate governance is not an end in itself. It's a means to ensure that we grow our small, medium enterprises to larger entities.
Okay, all right. When you look at the continent at this point, are you optimistic that in 10 years' time, this continent will be a continent that is participating meaningfully in the global economy? Because we normally seen as just a little part of the global economy. We don't really take part. So do you see this continent playing a meaningful, we're blessed with a lot of natural resources across the continent, but these things have to leave our continent, go to Europe or go to Asia, and they come back as products that are quite expensive for us to buy. Yet, the raw materials came from here. Are we looking at beneficiation basically of our raw materials and growing our economies?
It's starting. I don't think that it's at a stage where we can begin to be proud of. But if you look at what Ghana and Ivory Coast are doing with their cocoa, the beneficiation and ensuring that they transform that into chocolate that we love. If you look at the diamonds in Botswana, what they're doing with transforming those diamonds. So it's starting to happen. Is it moving at the pace at which we can be hopeful that we will achieve those results sooner rather than later? Certainly not. There's still a lot of work to be done. But what I'm encouraged about that there are women and men, and particularly the youth of this continent, whose passion and love for this continent is so great that they see only growth, that they only see an integrated Africa. And so they have made it their life's work to find solutions, to find ways to ensure that this becomes a reality. It's a difficult road to have to travel, the integration agenda. And you need people for that. And Africa does have the right people in place. Now, as you said, we just need to ensure that we pull our resources together. Now, that's going to be a lot harder than, we think. And there's still a lot of scope for us to make some changes. There's still a lot of scope for us to adapt our strategies, but we're moving in the right direction. And unfortunately, like I said earlier on, change is a long road. Yeah.
So you talked about the African free trade that came into play. I think about a month or so ago, not long ago. But how realistic is that? Shouldn't we be starting with regional economic blocks? Promoting trade in the regions and build from that to actually, fostering then the intra-Africa trade, across.
Yeah, that's definitely a good place. You probably work in the space already, because it's about how the regional blocks, how strong they are. So we're lucky that East Africa, for example, is leading in this area. So if you look at the East Africa area, you will see that they already have mechanisms for for intertrading, amongst their countries. If you look at the West Africa, ECOWAS is one of those blocks as well that, they're currently negotiating for a common currency.
Yeah.
If you look at SADC, we haven't done so well. In fact, we have a lot of work to do. So, but, what is heartening is that we can look at East Africa and see what they've done and learn from the mistakes that they've had to learn from and not necessarily have to repeat it. But more importantly, I think, this is the work of every citizen on this continent. It starts with us. We have to be all, gathered around this common purpose of integrating the continent.
All right. No, thank you. Now, obviously I'm a medical guy. I must throw in some questions, around that space. And this is really more around, Africa as a continent, has been battling with a lot of infectious diseases, still battling malaria, TB, poverty-related, clinical conditions, and this and that and that and that. Now we're in the middle of COVID. And well, South Africa is a champion there in terms of numbers. It's nothing to be proud about. Followed by Egypt, and then Nigeria somewhere around number 3, and the other countries they followed. Now, at a time like this, it would be nice if South African scientists, not South African, African scientists could collaborate and be part of coming up with solutions to this pandemic. About a few months ago, I hosted another friend who's at HSRC, who had written an article about the fact that there's a failure of investment by African countries, into research, but not only investment in research, but also promoting, collaboration between scientists across, the continent. Now, and then what comes up? We've got, Artemisia annua from Madagascar. We shout that it's a cure, but we have not followed proper scientific, ways of proving whether a medicine actually works or not. And when people, you see that WHO and other bodies don't take that seriously, we then think, oh, there they are again. They don't want progress or something that comes from Africa. Yet at the same time, a consortium from Germany and America, and also I think Denmark, is working on the same Artemisia annua, and they'll most probably, get, a result because they follow the right scientific processes. And we're gonna cry foul to say, no, but this thing, it came from Madagascar. So how do we, at a scientific level, foster investment in scientific research for Africans to actually develop solutions to African problems, rather than just being collaborators to things that like now we are collaborating with scientists from Oxford about the vaccine for COVID. All right, they've done, the various stages. I think now we're at phase 3 of human trials, and before the end of the year, most probably there will be an answer on that. So we are collaborating, but we're not coming up with our own things. How do we foster a culture where we respect science, we invest in science, we encourage young Africans, not South Africans, young Africans to actually be part of solving the challenges of the continent?
I think the person who has the right answers to that question will probably be a billionaire one day. Yeah. But my sense, Fundile, is as Africans, as you have said, we have for centuries, we have relied on our own science, on our own medicine. Otherwise, if that hadn't worked, we would all be extinct by now.
Yeah.
So it cannot be that all the answers, the scientific answers, must come from the West, right? And yet, I think year after year, we lament this lack of promotion or research further into our own systems, scientific systems, into our own medicines.
Yeah.
And I do think, as you are rightly pointing out, that partly it's an issue of finance. So where does research come from? Where does the research money come from? If you're looking at government, government will tell you whatever money they have competes with health, competes with education, primary education, and so on. So then the question has got to be, can the source of funding for this kind of research only be government? And the answer is no. And just like the answer to many of our challenges is no, it's not just government's role. So it's a question for me, of saying, how do we bring all business, bring it together with science, with scientists? How do we ensure that they see value in funding whatever work is being done by scientists? Because currently, either they don't see the value, or they're not being invited to the conversation. Or perhaps we don't have enough scientists, which is an area of skills capacity on its own. So, are we introducing science at an early enough stage for young learners, and particularly girls and women? And we do have in place highly rated scientists. We know that without a doubt. So it's not a question of that they do not exist, but it's a question of funding, really. And it's a question of the recognition that if you're sitting in South Africa, you can actually collaborate with someone who's sitting in Togo or Benin. But as I said earlier on, I think we are not there yet. So we have the AU, which is very instrumental, but they're just sitting at heads of state level. And so all the layers of African societies are not, they don't have this platform, or if it's there, it's not working as effectively as it should. So that is what I see as our role. So for instance, you as Dr. Fundile, you are in this space. To what extent are you engaging with people in Ghana who are also very concerned about the effects and the impact of COVID-19 in the societies, who have these stories, and they're there, so it's a question of each African has to really take up space in this particular regard.
I mean, as we were preparing for this interview, I did share with you that a few weeks ago, I interviewed, Dr. Ankh Shabalala, who is the Department of Science and Innovation. And he is heading a 5-year-old Indigenous Knowledge Systems unit. And when he was, chatting to me, he made me aware that, in the top 5 of countries in the world that are rich in terms of indigenous plants with medicinal and other properties, I mean, you've got DRC, the area around DRC, very, very rich. South Africa also is in the top 5, but Brazil, is actually leading around the Amazon forest and all of that. So if we could actually just collaborate as African countries that are rich in these indigenous plants, we could unleash an economic boom. Obviously, doing proper research, we could unleash an economic boom, solving the problems of Africa and the world, just because of the riches that we have. And he's pioneering some work in terms of collaborating scientists and indigenous knowledge holders, so that people don't steal the IP, go away and make money, but the knowledge holders actually benefit, from these things. So I'm just saying there definitely is a need for us as Africans to realize that the stuff that has been used for thousands of years by our grannies and forefathers and whatever, there's value, but obviously for them to get to a point where they can be used commercially, and be maybe prescribed so that they can be, paid for by medical aid and stuff. We have to play the game. Not that we need Western people to actually validate our things, but just for us to be able to tap into the next level of the economies. I think that's the thing that I feel we need to do just for us to unleash, those economic opportunities that at this moment are not fully exploited.
I think you are 100% correct. And I don't know if you noted that the countries that you've mentioned, they're all sitting in the south. So south of the equator. So you've got Brazil, you've got South Africa, the Congo, and probably the Central African Republic. And if you move towards the east, I wouldn't be surprised if you pick Thailand and India as some
India,
of those countries.
Even China as well,
Yes. So and that begins to say to us, who are our other partners actually? So for the longest time ever, we have strengthened and relied on partnerships with the North, with the West, the US or Europe, and perhaps our partners should be those that are in the South, what we call the South-South cooperation. And so those are the new allies and the new partners for Africa's development, because we can't do this on our own. But, the right partner will also determine how far you can go. And therefore, we need to question the sort of partnerships that we keep for ourselves. It's pretty much like a marriage. Are you in the right sort of partnership? And if you are not, you can only go so far.
Yeah. All right. I now want us to work towards wrapping this thing. It's been a long interview, but it was important. Yes. You see, we are featuring you, so we had to start with where you come from, all this up until where you are, and it's something that I'm just doing for this period of the Women's Month. Other interviews will be shorter, but for featured people like you, we need more time to tap into your wisdom. So as you are sitting there, getting involved in assisting the AU via the APRM, what are the things that you look at doing now as Tumi over the next 3 years?
Well,
so that when I call you 3 years from now, I can say, Tumi, you said this is what you're going to do in 3 years.
Is it happening?
Yeah.
Well, I guess now it has to happen, right?
Yeah.
So I think part of my journey from here on, I'm hoping will involve it's also still a Pan-African journey, because that's what I'm committed to working towards. I'm hoping that we will have a platform that will enable Africans from different spheres of disciplines that are not necessarily sitting at heads of state level to say the different sectors, how to ensure, as you were saying, that scientists from South Africa and scientists from Togo or from Sudan have a platform to work together. And that's what I'm hoping that I will be doing. I would like very much to establish a Pan-African independent organization that will ensure that it brings together Africans and ensure that we all play a meaningful role towards Africa's development.
Yes. No, thank you. I must thank you for the time you've given us. I had said maximum 90 minutes, but we actually about 1 hour 48 minutes of talking. You didn't even feel that time going. That's how much.
No, I didn't.
It's been so interesting. But the last part of our discussion, there's something about CAF. You are supposed to introduce governance, governance standards at CAF. Now, when I think soccer and I think governance, because of all the stories, at FIFA and all of that, even CAF. So one starts to think, is this not Mission Impossible? Yeah, the standards will be there, but enforcement of the standards, how possible is it in an old boys club? So let's just, the last few minutes that you have, just talk to us about that.
Well, so CAF is an old organization. It's a confederation of all the football associations on the continent. And so I was invited last year to be part of their first governance committee because they'd never had it before. And obviously they'd been faced with a number of scandals over a period of time around either misappropriation of funds at the CAF level or even within associations themselves. And I think, we know with our own experiences at SAFA, and, we know with players that go overseas and there's lying about their age. So there's a myriad of issues around governance in football. So CAF took the decision that, look, we've got to address this once and for all. So that it's a 5-person committee that's been put together. And really it's about saying, let us introduce some reforms that are intended to bring better governance within firstly CAF and then the associations. So, I don't believe in mission impossible.
I'll just make a devil's advocate, but yeah.
It's hard, it's difficult. We're at the stage where we are currently consulting with different associations and looking at what are some of the issues and challenges. And the next step is really to produce some form of, or present some form of an outline in terms of these are the challenges that we've found, and we've diagnosed the associations with these kinds of issues, and these are the reforms we would like to put forward. So again, I mean, there is no shortage for that kind of input. The question always is, will they actually be put into place? Will they be complied with? And I would say that remains to be seen.
Yeah. All right. The last thing, I promise is the last one. You were recently, was it elected or nominated, or whatever, the president of the Harvard University Association in South Africa.
Yes.
What did that mean to you, or what does it mean to you, and what does it entail?
Well, so yes, like I said, it's a very recent position or role. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to me as someone who has come from what Dambuza wrote, and who knows and understands that it really is through the power of education that I am where I am today, whereas I could be invited by a continental body to come and assist it. And so it's about saying, how do we begin to provide access, or at least promote access to quality education for people like myself who may not necessarily have that readily available for them. So basically, the association is a group of former Harvard graduates who are based in South Africa and the continent. And it's supposed to bring all of us together to look at how we make a contribution in our own countries, whatever difficult situations we are facing, and to lean on each other's intellectual abilities, each other's experiences to shape some of the issues. And I must say that, and obviously we work closely with Harvard faculty. So what we have at our disposal is to say, if we need, for instance, an area of economics, we could link up with a Harvard faculty member, a professor, and they could advise on A, B, and C. So I do think that it's an incredible platform from which to advocate for quality education, particularly for young girls and women in this country. And that's certainly where I plan to make a contribution, God willing.
Yeah. Any possibilities of twinning some of the South African universities, with the likes of Harvard, the MITs, the Stanford, and those kind of of universities?
So we've started talking about it. And in fact, earlier on in the year before COVID, the vice provost of Harvard University was here in South Africa, and we spoke a bit. And I know that there is some efforts towards that particular partnerships there. So I do intend to take up that conversation now that I'm in this role. Of course, when he came and I had a conversation with him, I was not the president then, but now I am. And so I do plan to use the platform for those sort of discussions.
Thank you, Tumi. it has been an enjoyable, almost 2 hours of chatting with you. Your village, KwaDambuza.
Yes.
Your clan name.
Say that again.
Your clan name. We've got clan names, so I know in Zulu there are clan names. Yeah.
Okay, Umfamanda, Imfolozenhle, Ketabaweni.
Oh, thank you very much, Tumi. I really enjoyed it. It was not as scary as you thought before we had the conversation, and I want to thank everybody who connected, with our conversation. And I will be sending you a clip of this conversation, on YouTube, so that you can share it with the rest of the people who are interested, who may not have been able to join in. But thank you very much. It's so important that we realize that we are Africans, we are in the African continent. This thing about South Africa and Africa there, we are part of the continent. We need to know that for the continent to move forward, it depends on all of us, as Africans. And Africans, to me, everybody who pays their allegiance, and who's got an interest of seeing Africa, moving forward. So thank you to me, and thank you to all the viewers. I hope that the conversation was able to at least spark something within you about how to be part of solving, the big elephant, challenges of the continent, and how can we just have small bites, and at a certain point we actually get to the Africa of our dreams. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to me. Till next time.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.